You were expecting someone else?
Welcome to Random Movie Reviews. I'm Nathan, and today I'll be talking about Goldeneye. So this is a follow-up to my previous video, which I did on Timothy Dalton's James Bond. I talked about his two movies that he did during his time as Bond, starting with The Living Daylights, ending with License to Kill. In that video, I talk about how much I appreciate these movies, how ahead of their time they were in retrospect in comparison to all the other Bond movies before them. And I also talk about how both movies are flawed in their own specific ways. And I mentioned in that video that if you took the strongest elements of both movies and you put it into one movie, you'd have a pretty close to perfect Bond film. And then I realized something. The follow-up to License to Kill, which is Goldeneye, a film that Timothy Dalton was originally going to be James Bond in for the third time, but ended up leaving due to the film falling into development hell with a bunch of licensing and rights issues and behind-the-scenes drama. His contract expired, and he ended up walking away as being James Bond. Goldeneye is kind of an example of that, where it takes the strengths of both License to Kill, The Living Daylights, all the elements that I like of those movies, put it in Goldeneye, and Goldeneye, in my personal opinion, is one of the best Bond movies, and that is an opinion that is held by many a Bond fan. This is a film that I see routinely named as being one of the best Bond movies. It's almost in every top 5 I've ever seen. And in an interesting turn of fate, Pierce Brosnan ends up taking over as being James Bond in Goldeneye, which is funny because we all know that originally they wanted Pierce Brosnan to be Bond in The Living Daylights, but due to his contract being ironclad in Remington Steel, he couldn't break free from that. So the producers ended up getting Timothy Dalton because of that. So kind of interesting how that story kind of bookends. I really do believe that Goldeneye is kind of the perfect Bond movie. Now, that's not to say that it's my all-time favorite. It's one of my all-time favorites. It's definitely in my top 5, maybe even top 3. This is one of my most rewatched Bond movies. It was my favorite as a kid, and then when 2006 happened, Casino Royale came out, then that all changed. And I still stand by the opinion that Casino Royale is the best Bond movie, but it's the best Bond movie for completely different reasons. In terms of giving Bond an emotional center, dissecting the character in a way that we've never seen in any other Bond film, and how accurate it is to the way Ian Fleming wrote the character, that's why Casino Royale is the best Bond movie, because it is the most emotional, it's the most intense, it's the most accurate in terms of representing Ian Fleming's character, the way he wrote the character. I can understand people not liking Casino Royale because it is so much darker and more intense and more serious than pretty much every other Bond movie, but that's precisely why I love it so much. That movie transcends from being just a great Bond movie to being one of the greatest action spy movies ever, in my personal opinion. But in terms of a film that represents the 007 franchise as a whole, in terms of having all of the staples and trends that you would want to see in a Bond movie, in terms of having a memorable villain in that of 006 with Sean Bean, who's one of the best Bond villains ever in my opinion, in terms of having 2 very memorable Bond girls, one of which, the femme fatale Xenia Onatopp, is probably the best femme fatale in the entire series. Having memorable gadgets with the laser watch and the exploding pen. I mean, some of the best gadgets and best gadget scenes in the series are in Goldeneye. Having one of the greatest openings in the series. In fact, it's probably my favorite opening of the entire franchise, with 007 and 006 back in the 80s infiltrating a Russia military base during the Cold War. We see 006 getting killed, and then we see how that unfolds later on in the movie. Pierce Brosnan skydiving after a plane with no parachute. I mean, to this day, it's still one of the best action sequences. And of course, the opening with the whole dam sequence when we see Bond jump off the dam with a bungee cord. One of the best stunts in the whole franchise either. I mean, the opening of this movie is it's perfect. One of the best Bond theme songs with Tina Turner singing Goldeneye. Absolutely love that. We get the Aston Martin DB5 and a gorgeous BMW. So you get the Bond cars, the gadgets, the girls, the villain, the Bond ally, who is the reluctant ally, played by Robbie Coltrane, Valentine Zukovsky, who ends up coming back playing the same character in The World's Not Enough, so that's kind of fun. This is also the introduction of Judi Dench playing M, and she is the best M of the entire series. Goldeneye came out in the mid-90s, which that was kind of the turning point for political correctness and stuff like that, and Bond was seen as being, well, actually M straight up tells James Bond what a lot of critics of the Bond series thought of him to be.
Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur. A relic of the Cold War.
And that's a brilliant little meta moment in the movie. And overall, Judi Dench is just amazing in everything, and the way she progresses throughout the series, especially when we get to the Daniel Craig era, is also quite brilliant. So yeah, Judi Dench as M is just another example of taking that classic Bond staple, that character, and elevating it to another level. It just has all of the elements that should be in a classic Bond movie. It has all of those elements. And because of that, I think it's one of the most perfect Bond movies, and as well as being probably the best entry point for getting someone into Bond. Because if you get somebody into Bond, starting with Dr. No, and I actually really enjoyed Dr. No, but it does feel so different from all the other Bond movies, even though it does have some of the classic staples we'd see get repeated throughout the series. You know, it's not very action-packed. It's quite slow. It wouldn't be until Goldfinger where we start getting the blueprint of what makes a Bond movie. These are the elements you need in order to create the classic Bond movie. Goldeneye has that, but it also still has that modern edge. I think this movie is aged really, really well. With the exception of some of the music choices. Overall, I like a lot of the music. I like the score in this movie, but there's that one famous scene where Bond is flirtatiously doing a car chase with Xenia, and I don't know what the fuck that music score is. It's absolutely atrocious. But outside of that, I do like the music, and of course we have some of the classic James Bond music cues throughout this movie as well. That's my one kind of nitpick, but in terms of like hitting all those beats, having the blueprint and perfecting it, Goldeneye does that, in my personal opinion. Now, the way that Pierce Brosnan plays Bond in this movie, I mean, he is the suavest Bond. He's the most smooth. And according to many women Bond fans out there, he is the most attractive, which I'm not going to argue against that. In Goldeneye in particular, he actually does strike that balance of having that classic charm that's very Connery-esque, while also having some very intense, brooding physicality in his performance that is reminiscent of Timothy Dalton. Anytime that he has to face off against with 006, we see that intensity. And that final scene where, you know, the death of 006, one of the best villain deaths in the entire franchise. I mean, that whole scene, just the brooding face, the intensity, it feels very reminiscent of Timothy Dalton. It strikes that balance perfectly, where you get the intensity, the physical capabilities that you would want in James Bond, while having the charm, the suave elements of Connery, even some of the wink humorous moments of like a Roger Moore, but it never goes too far into that campy territory.
This is a class 4 grenade.
They all said the pen was mightier than the sword.
Thanks to me, they were right.
And let's talk a little bit about 006. I mean, one of the reasons why 006 is often named as being one of the best Bond villains is because of the personal connection he has with Bond. Even some of the better Bond movies throughout the franchise, like, you know, like Goldfinger, for example, he is just an average super villain. You know what I mean? In the Bond universe, he is the average supervillain who has this crazy, outlandish plot. There's not really a personal connection between him and Bond. There doesn't necessarily need to be, but that's kind of what takes Goldeneye to another level, is the fact that, you know, 006 was very close with 007, not just in the fact that they worked together, but they were genuinely friends, and then the way 006 portrayed 007 with his whole personal motivation of, you know, having a vendetta against the British government for what they did to him, for what they did to his family. And so he has this whole elaborate plot of stealing this secret military weapon known as the Goldeneye, which is essentially a nuclear EMP that he's going to use to financially destroy Britain while also stealing all of the money. Honestly, his motivation for going against, you know, England and wanting to steal the money and put it in financial collapse, I mean, that's fairly shallow in terms of villainous motivations, but that doesn't even matter. What matters is the connection that he has with James and the rivalry that they have. And that takes this movie to another level, where it's like he's not just your boilerplate Bond villain in that he wants to, you know, destroy the world. He does have that part of him to him. That is an aspect of him, but it's that personal connection with James that makes this movie so exciting, and anytime they have a conflict with each other. I mentioned in The Living Daylights and License to Kill that I have a problem with how bloated the third acts in both of those movies are and how those movies take a really long time to get to the goods, as I call it. Goldeneye does not have that problem. By the time we get to the final act of this movie and we have James and Natalia, which we'll talk about Natalia, she's one of my favorite Bond girls. By the time they get to the satellite and we have that whole amazing final confrontation between him and 006, and before that we have like the pen explosion scene with Boris, who is like, you know, one of those quirky Bond characters that, you know, is just memorable. That whole scene with the pen is amazing. All of the action sequences in this movie are some of the best in the entire series. The shootouts are amazing. That whole tank scene in the movie is incredible. The train sequence is amazing. I mean, just the action is some of the best in the whole series. But that ending with the whole satellite, and then we have the confrontation between him and 006, and for England, James, no for me, which is a brilliant callback to the beginning of this movie, and that death, and then those satellite falling on top of him. It's like, oh man, the entire third act, one of the best. I mean, this movie has one of the best openings in the franchise, one of the best third acts in the franchise also. Now let's talk a little bit about the Bond girls, because throughout the series, we have two different types of Bond girls, and we see these in numerous Bond movies where there's the good Bond girl and then there's the bad Bond girl. And this movie is a brilliant example of those character archetypes. With the good Bond girl, we have Natalia, who is a programmer at the Russian lab that developed the Goldeneye weapon. And she strikes that balance of not being too much of a damsel in distress, although there are moments in this movie where she does play that part of that character, but she's also genuinely a capable Bond girl who aids James in a way that is convincing and makes sense in the context of the story. Her being particularly knowledgeable about computers and her having her own Bond villain with that of Boris in this movie is a really fun and awesome dynamic. I love the way that develops throughout the film. She's actually useful, is what I'm saying. And there's a ton of Bond girls throughout the franchise that aren't useful at all. They're just there to look sexy and gorgeous, and you know, I don't really complain about that too much either, but in Goldeneye, it's just one of the many examples of when I say it takes the classic tropes and blueprint of previous Bond movies and it perfects them by giving us a Bond girl who's not only gorgeous and has terrific chemistry with James, but is actually capable and useful, aiding him in his adventure. And then on the polar opposite of that, we have Zinnia Onatopp, played brilliantly by Famke Janssen. She is the best female Bond villain, like, ever. She is, like, obviously incredibly attractive, very seductive, but also, like, scary. And the like sexual pleasure she gets out of like murdering men, whether it's between her thighs or that scene where they break into the lab with the evil general guy at the beginning of the movie and she's shooting all of them and she's making all those weird moans. It's like, it's so like off-putting and creepy, but that's what makes her such a memorable Bond villain. And she's intimidating as hell while also being extremely attractive. She is the best female Bond villain, female fatale in the whole series. I stand by that. If anyone disagrees, I want to hear your counter argument, because what beats her? She is so awesome in this movie. It is the perfect Bond movie in terms of representing the franchise as a whole. You get the awesome action sequences that are fun as hell to watch, and you also get the fun spy classic Bond stuff with the gadgets, the cars, the women, the villain. It takes all the elements and it perfects them to a T. And of course, I can't forget to mention that, you know, Goldeneye would spawn one of the most important video games of all time, of course, being 007 Goldeneye for Nintendo 64. Personally, I still think that Nightfire is the best James Bond game ever, but you can't deny that Goldeneye was revolutionary for first-person shooters, and the genre would not be what it is today without that game. And it came from this movie, so how awesome is that? That's my thoughts on Goldeneye. I want to hear from you guys, especially the Bond fans. What are your thoughts on this movie? Do you like it, love it? Do you hate it? Do you agree with my points on it being a pretty perfect Bond movie? Do you heavily disagree? Make sure to mention that in the comments. All I ask is you be respectful about it. And as always, thank you guys for watching.